welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. I am your host, Karim Sirajuddin. Thank you for tuning in. Today, Dr. Abdallah Rothman is joining me once again to discuss Islam and psychology.
Recognize Allah and to understand Allah's relationship to the process of healing and to the overall trajectory of the person's existence.
He had one of the top 5 episodes in 2018. It was called Spiritual Quest. So he shares with us some examples from his work, as well as principles that all believers can apply, whether Muslim or otherwise. The principles are the same if you believe or trust and are secure in the evidence that there is a creator. This creator has to be central to your consciousness and your actions in this life. Now we're going to jump right into when Dr. Abdallah breaks down the association that he has been a part of for several years. Abdallah?
This project, it's called the International Association of Islamic Psychology. And ironically, I think you in one of your previous podcasts had mentioned, would there be this time once in the future where there might be an association, just like there is the American Psychology Association. And so, yes, that time is here.
MashaAllah.
It's based around 4 areas of focus: education, certification, publication, and research. And so people would be able to join as members to the association and have access to sort of everything that's going on in the development of the field. And the idea is, much like the American Psychology Association, is that it's this sort of umbrella for sort of regulating the standards of practice of the field of Islamic psychology and advancing the development of the field. Especially in this case where it's such an emerging and developing field, it's really about helping to advance this in a professional manner.
MashaAllah, that's phenomenal news. I'm very excited to hear about that. Malik Bedre was one of the first individuals that, to my knowledge, translated some of the works of ilm al-nafs, or traditional Islamic psychology, into English. And you can look him up and find several of his books and articles, as well as others like Dr. Amber Haq, and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in the field, you're interested in these 2 subject matters, definitely check out some of those individuals and their work, inshallah.
The idea is to take on that legacy of those pioneers in the field and, sort of canonize that legacy and move it forward into the next generation. There's so many young and upcoming people in this field, and so the real goal is to bring everybody together. And one more thing,
that'll be $5.
Yeah, you heard it here first on Coffee. But so we're launching the website soon. Maybe even by the time this is aired, it will be launched, and it's islamiccpsychology.org. And so people can find out all about the different projects that have going on and become members of the association.
So thank you for that, Abdallah. And also, I'm very excited about the topic that you and I are going to explore today, because we're both very interested in this field. What do you think is the difference between psychology and Islamic psychology?
I think the fundamental difference is it's about ontology. It's about the fundamental understanding of human nature. I think when we think of psychology in terms of application and approaches, there's quite a lot that is applicable and similar and not necessarily at odds with. But when we talk about psychology as the understanding of the human being and the human condition, that is when it gets into, I would say, fundamentally different viewpoints of what we're even describing as a human being, what we talk about when we talk about things like the self. And this is where it's really important to understand that an Islamic paradigm of the human condition, and therefore understanding psychology, is fundamentally different. And one example of that is there's it's on several levels, but one example is in a conventional, I would say, Western approach to psychology, much of what we're focused on is the self. And when we talk about defining the self from that context, it's mostly a conglomeration of a construct of identity that is based in our lives in this world. So from birth until the point where the person comes into therapy. And during that time, they have their memories, their experiences, their cultural orientations, their whatever trauma they've been through, whatever upbringing they've had, whatever positive memories they've had, all these come together and construct an identity that we call the self. And so a lot of what psychology is doing is sorting out that identity. And what, from an Islamic perspective of psychology, we're talking about an identity that is beyond, even from before birth and after death. And so what we're talking about is the soul. And that the soul is really what our goal is in treatment in Islamic psychology, and in getting the person to identify, orienting the person to this awareness and knowledge that they, in essence, are a soul, and that their identity is connected to this much longer trajectory than just the memories that they've formulated in this construct of who they conceive themselves to be. And so this opens up a much wider perspective of what you're even dealing with in something like psychotherapy when you're talking about applied psychology, because it's about the sort of way that we understand what the soul is, from an Islamic perspective, and what that how that interacts with our emotions and our experiences of states of being. And so this is what the focus is and what we're working with from that context.
Right. So if I were to take a stab at it, Islamic psychology, it takes this idea of, understanding the self, development, mental processes, emotions, behaviors, all these types of things. What is considered health? What isn't considered healthy? What's functioning? What's not a functioning psyche? But it has to be encased in this ontology or this worldview that what essentially makes humans humans is not their body, but it's the spirit, it's the soul. And if the soul or the spirit is not being nourished or directed or reflecting its origin and its return, i.e. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there's always going to be a part of the human being that isn't being quote-unquote treated or acknowledged, right? So this of course is a huge difference between, secular psychology, let's just call it, and Islamic psychology. So Islamic psychology is about keeping the soul in its place and recognizing it is the source of the human condition and the human experience.
Right. And I would say it's a very holistic approach to psychology.
Right. It's integral.
Oftentimes we think of psychology, people think, when you see a psychology workshop, there's this picture of a brain or something, right? and oftentimes when you go and you study psychology, a lot of students, I talk to them and they're, what are you studying? Like, they're studying the brain and they're studying, neuropsychology, really, which is like a sort of a different thing. What we talk about when we talk about, when you talk about psychotherapy and really trying to get in and understand and help people grow and understand themselves, this is much more in the realm of philosophy than it is in science. It is rooted in things like ontology and how we make sense of the nature of human beings. And so, but from an Islamic perspective of that human being and the soul, the mind is only one aspect. The cognitive functioning is only one aspect of that self, that soul. And so what that means is, when we, in Western psychology, probably one of the most popular modes of therapy is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's nothing Islamically at odds with CBT. As a matter of fact, there's a book that Malik Bedre translated of I believe it's a ninth century scholar who essentially completely lays out what we now know as CBT. And a lot of this was being drawn from Islamic knowledge. And so the idea is that those most of the things that we're doing in Western psychology are great, they're useful, they're helpful, but they're one piece of a much larger puzzle. And so in an Islamic psychology approach, we're dealing with the bigger picture. And so we may use a CBT approach, but we wouldn't use that as the primary method, and our primary goal would not necessarily only be changing the person's thoughts. That would be useful in orienting the person towards aligning the rest of the soul, so the heart and the spirit and the sort of lower drives of the human being, and putting all these things together. So treatment then becomes more of a holistic thing, and oftentimes we're even dealing with things like the body, some things that would normally be thought of as more like alternative healing, like body work, But for me, when I'm doing therapy, one of the first things I do is try and orient a person towards their body, because I'm trying to get away from this idea that our self or our identity is located in our heads or in our brains. As in the West, this idea of cogito ergo sum, like I think therefore I am, has really influenced all of society across the world, in that we're these sort of floating heads. And so it's really bringing people back down into the rest of themselves. So it's understanding the structure of the soul. So often, a lot of people if you're familiar with Islamic just theology, have heard of qalb, aql, ruh, nafs. But this, in the context of psychology, these terms are really useful in helping us understand the sort of anatomy of the soul, so that we can then sort of devise treatment that targets this holistic picture of the human being, rather than just the mind.
Right. Now, if I were to kind of just paint a picture here, a framework for us to work with. So let's talk about some of these terms and how they all work together. So first thing is, you have ruh. My understanding of ruh is it's the spirit, or it's the life force. It's the thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blew into Adam alayhi salam and into all human beings. That's what makes us alive and animated, so to speak. But the ruh as its own entity, if we picture it as this like pure, clear, luminous thing, right? Because we don't really know what kind of a substance it is, so to speak, but it's something that's luminous, something that is, it knows Allah, and its attributes reflect Allah's divine reality better than anything else. And the body is the contrast of that. The body is dark, the body is heavy, the body is material, and it needs materials. And so when you put this spirit into the body, this now becomes the self, right? Or the nafs. And your nafs can either be more aligned with your spiritual essence, or it can be pulled down and more attached to the bodily component, right? And essentially this is like the struggle of the human being, according to Islam, right? We're always working towards purification, transformation of our hearts, of our, consciousness, of our bodies, to align with the divine pattern. This is the one way to kind of understand an overall simplified picture of, you have a spiritual essence and an earthly bodily essence, and when the two combine, you become this total self, which then generates the intellect, it generates the heart, it generates intentions and desires. But then there's this it's a constant project, right, within ourselves. And so the human is either becoming, more angelic or beyond the angelic reality? Because as we know in Islam, the angels are, in a sense, bodies of light, right? And the jinn are bodies of fire, and humans are bodies of earth and water. And so we have these different kind of containers, but the nature of our containers, as well as how close or distant we are from the divine source, can determine a lot about our state of health, our state of consciousness, fulfillment, and success in this life and the next. So just kind of a simple way to put it all together for people that don't know what these terms mean. Do you feel like that you'd like to add more to that, or do you feel like that's a good basic, 101 way to kind of picture all this?
Yeah, no, that's a really good picture of it. I mean, like you described, it's this. There's essentially a dynamic interplay happening in the soul, and this is where our our will comes in. Is we have this will that we can essentially direct our energy one way or the other, either towards the ruh and reflecting that light of Allah and becoming more of our true self and being aligned with fitra, so we can become who we really are underneath the veils and layers of sort of crust that has built up over our ruh, essentially, or over our heart and soul, so that this is why, when I was saying people identify with the memories and the self-construct and the trauma and the things that have happened in this life, those can become crust that covers over that true self, that fitra. And so when somebody in that interplay, if they're not exerting their willpower to, it takes effort. It's not a easy thing. It's natural in the sense that I think there's a trajectory that's laid out in our lives that we're oriented towards growth and sort of coming back to this place of fitra. But there's also a very strong natural pull from our nafs, from our that's oriented towards dunya, and we forget. We're very forgetful. The root of the word insan is also forgetfulness, and so we come into a state of ghafla, of essentially forgetting Allah and forgetting our fitra state. And that's just if we follow sort of the impulses of what our nafs want, and we go, we hear a lot of things, and this is somewhat times problematic in Western psychology, is there's this sort of sometimes feeding into the nafs of like, well, do what's good for you. There's this identity, there's this notion that like you're going to be better off if you do what you want to do. And I think, that comes from a place of like self-empowerment, which is great. And there's an aspect of that is healthy. But when it's not in balance with this wisdom of understanding the dynamics of the soul and what the dangers are and what our actual goal is in healing and what healing means, then if we follow what we want, oftentimes it's not what's good for us. I can remember times in my life where I wasn't as on this path of really struggling and striving to do what's, align myself with my fitra. And I was on a path of more like, well, I'm going to do what feels right, or what feels, feeling right can be good sometimes, but more like what feels good, what I want, what I prefer. And as much as that feels good in some ways, it always led me to a place of disappointment or dissatisfaction or just trouble because, I'm not the best judge of what's good for me. And so I'm a good judge of what's comfortable for me, but that's not necessarily going to lead me to my higher state. And so, part of an Islamic approach to psychology is the therapist helping to be a mirror for the client in sort of holding up like, well, what do you really want here? Do you want to just go further into what you want, and how has that worked for you? Has that worked well for you? Have you got, do you feel like you're living your dream, you're living your best self? or is it causing all kinds of problems? Most of the time when we follow, somebody's difficulties in presenting problem, you can easily track back like how they got there and how it's connected to something they were following that they thought was going to be good for them because it felt good. And ultimately, by understanding what those pitfalls are and those traps, so like Imam Ghazali talks about the muhlikat and the munjiyat, essentially similar to like a Platonic idea of vices and virtues, and that we have these character traits of like jealousy and lust and envy that are natural. They're totally natural parts of the human being, and so it's not to deny them or to shame ourselves for having them, but it's to be aware, to bring our awareness to when we start falling into these types of characters and making an effort to, with our will and our self conscious awareness, to direct our energy into perfecting our character. So in Arabic, it's tahdib al-akhlaq, the reformation of character, and this is a very integral part of an Islamic approach to psychology, because like Ghazali pointed out in Ihya al-Ulumuddin, he almost lays it out as diseases and treatments, right? So there's these diseases of the heart. So envy, when you're in this place, you're it's like a sickness in your heart that if you allow it to continue, it like festers and will continue building this crust over your heart and get you in this deeper into this state of ghafla. Whereas if you assert your willpower and bring your awareness to what's happening in yourself, and you attempt to try to emulate these character traits that are higher, like courage and wisdom and justice, and these are getting more in line with like the character, like the Asma al-Husna, the 99 names of Allah, and we're reflecting that through that ruh. We're reflecting Allah's light, and this is how we become, moving up towards that trajectory of perfecting ourselves. And this is, a lot of people will argue like, well, isn't that more of a higher functioning level of like perfecting the self versus, people think of psychology as like, well, if people have mental illness or mental health issues. And I would say that it's all about, there's different levels of everything, and it's applicable at every level of where a person is at. And there's different approaches that are relevant to what a person is dealing with and going through at their stage.
Psychology considers the fact that there is a creator who made the human being. Therefore, the creator who designed the human being, who nourishes, who guides, who sustains the human being and everything else in the universe, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ultimately the greatest psychologist, if you think about it, right? Like the approach or the theory has to be rooted in our origin and the one who created us. Because he's the one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who sets the standard of what's considered good, evil, healthy, unhealthy, functioning, non-functioning. And those don't always align with secular psychology, although there's of course benefit and crossover from that too, right? And you also mentioned this other idea of the fitra. The fitra is this natural state of the human being, right? But how does that work exactly? Like we're all born on fitra. This is a common idea of in Islam. But if we're all born on fitra, and this means we're essentially good, and we have a blueprint for understanding this notion of tawheed, which is the assertion that everything is unified. God is one and unique, and everything's interconnected because it's being sourced from this one creator. So the fitra is like we're all born on this good natural state, which has a blueprint to know all of this or to be a part of all of this. But then it's the nurture or the environment that changes us, right? Or can change us or misdirect us, or it can nourish and establish that even further or deeper, right? So our developmental stages is the thing that determines, obviously where we are and how we've become what we've become, which is something that secular as well as Islamic psychology acknowledges. So the fitra, as you described it, as something that it can get buried or kind of, thrown behind the scenes, so to speak. And and I kind of, when I was thinking about it while you were talking earlier, it's like, well, the human body has water and earth. Earth, as we know, light can't penetrate through solid earth or solid matter, but water can be penetrated by light, right? And in this case, I'm talking about the light of God, right? This idea of when we feel illuminated or our spiritual side is reflecting this natural luminosity, we actually start to heal ourselves or align with our ultimate purpose and the ultimate standard of what it means to be a healthy human being, according to Islam. And so when the earth element within us, this body part of us, also this egoic attachment to the body and all of this, all these I needs and wants and wishes, if those things that I define as what feels good or what feels right is not checked by a standard, then it's very easy to think you're fine when you're actually astray or diseased according to Islamic psychology. So Abdullah, let me ask you this. I mean, we touched a bit about the paradigm of Islamic psychology. Obviously, this is, kind of a broad way of laying down the foundations, but maybe it'll help me and others understand how would this even work exactly. So let's say I come to you, I have severe social anxiety. I bite my nails. I, freak out about a lot of things like, am I going to make enough money? Am I going to find a parking spot? I'm just an anxious person, perhaps also a negative thinking person, right? Because that tends to be connected with anxiety, correct? How would you start to even work with me if I came to you and I said, look, these are my presenting problems?
Yeah. So where I would start would depend on where I get a sense of where the client is at in terms of what's the most present for them. So what I mean by that is oftentimes a person is so mired in the details of the story of what's happening to them and they haven't really talked about it before with anyone else, that no matter what I do, they're always going to come back to telling the details of the story. And so there's a certain, sometimes I'll just start with having them tell me what's happening. For me, as a therapist and from working from an Islamic psychology paradigm, I don't really need much of that story to work with them. It's more for their own, get it out of the way, to like bookmark, right? And so sometimes that's where we'll start. But if, from a therapist standpoint, where I would start from, if a person doesn't need to talk as much about it and they're just sort of ready to get the work done, my first approach would be orienting them towards their heart. And this is very much what I would conceive of as the fundamental aspect of an Islamic psychology approach, is that it's centered in the qalb, in the heart, and that this is the locus of the human being. And like I said before, most of our experience of life is centered in our minds. We walk, before the person comes in to see me, they're probably, the locus of their whole life has been in their mind and their thoughts. And so what I want to do is from the beginning is to sort of move them out of that head space, which is why I might let them tell that story first, so we can, so it doesn't keep cropping up. And then trying to locate all of the underlying emotional material that is underneath that story, underneath that cognitive construct of what they're struggling with. What I'm wanting to do is locating that material, that emotional material, in their soul. And so that means, again, this is holistic. So it's in their body. Their soul is a being in the body. And it occupies the whole body. So I will orient them towards first of all, having just an awareness of what their heart is and where their heart is located in the body. And what I mean is not necessarily the organ of the heart, but this area in the chest, sort of from shoulder to shoulder, and essentially almost like where your lungs are. And because that same place is where breathing happens, I'll oftentimes use breathing techniques to help them connect with their heart, because even just the physical location is in the same place. And it helps a person settle into their body.
So to settle, one of the first things you try to do is to get people into their bodies and be aware of their heart or their chest area. And this is one of the ways we can do this is by taking some deep breaths. And this helps reorient us into the body, correct? Okay. Are there any other ways that we can awaken or activate this organ of the heart? And you said you're not talking so much about the physical heart, right? Then what are you talking about? Because some people, when you say heart, that's exactly what they picture. So can you tell us more about that and other techniques to activate that or get into the body, as you said?
Anytime you have a feeling, you feel some sort of activity in this place in your body that is where your chest is. So when we have, when you have a crush on somebody, you get fluttering in the chest area, or when you're nervous about to go take a test, you call them butterflies. And oftentimes people either feel them like in their stomach or around in their chest area. And then also when people experience anxiety to whatever degree, so in this case you had posed the situation where the person is coming because they're experiencing anxiety. And from almost across the board, every client I've worked with that has had anxiety is they're experiencing constriction in their chest. Right, and so oftentimes that affects the breath. So they're unable to breathe. Their breath is constricted, and they feel a tension in their chest area. And so what I'm doing is I'm helping them identify with all of those experiences they've had that are located in that part of their body and that are connected to emotional or feeling experiences. And so like I said, whether it's anxiety or love or nervousness, there's this activity that's happening in this locus of their being. And so by attuning them to where this material is located and where this activity is happening, it's helping them pinpoint this locus of their being where we can access this material, and that it's not in the mind. The mind is a processing plant or unit for making sense of or projections of that material and that emotional stuff. So this is how I would help somebody identify with what I mean by the heart. And usually I don't have a hard time doing that. Like just by saying those few things that I just mentioned, people are like, oh yeah, wow, I definitely have that experience. And so then the more that I can help them key into like bringing awareness and attention to like, well, what did that feel like? What when you had that anxiety and that constriction, so they identified with the word constriction. So tell me more about that, and just explaining what the experience is of that constriction in their chest. The more we go into talking about it, suddenly it changes from like pain in the chest to like, we're talking about feeling statements, or like I was scared, or there's this fear under here, or there's this, you start to uncover different layers, and that's essentially what I'm trying to do, is locate their experience in the soul, and not in these other peripheral places where they have made sense of those experiences, whether it's the mind or even just sort of surface level body experiences, like my shoulder hurts, or my chest feels constricted, or I can't breathe, It's just helping them identify with those experiences and then bringing them in to locate where that is in their inner being, which is, I'm talking about their soul, and ultimately I think is focused in the qalb, in the heart. This area is sort of like the concentration of material happens within the soul. And so then it's a matter of once I've got them aligned or in a place of awareness of this more holistic experience, then we can start to work on what to do with moving and changing and re-evaluating and realigning all of that experience and material that exists there.
What I heard you say was you're helping with breathing, helping with getting back into the body, identifying deeper emotions, right? So how is that Islamic compared to, let's say, this practitioner over here who's like, just really into somatic psychology?
Yeah. There may be similar approaches to doing that, but then it's a matter of, okay, well, then what? Where are we going with that? Like, where is the trajectory of healing? What is the therapeutic treatment goal? So if you don't have an Islamic paradigm, then the therapeutic treatment goal might be feeling better or having less symptoms, right? This is also part of Islamic paradigm, but there is a fundamental reality to the goal is for the person to recognize Allah and to understand Allah's relationship to the process of healing and to the overall trajectory of the person's existence. So just getting the person to the point of like feeling good or understanding where the material of their emotional material is located is useful only to a certain degree, and then it's a matter of plugging that into a source, and understanding that the goal from an Islamic perspective, the goal of life, therefore the goal of psychology and the goal of healing is to remember Allah and to come back into this place of witnessing Allah's tawheed. We in our lives, we get mired and stuck in this illusion or delusion that we are separate and that we're separate beings and that we have this separate trajectory that we are controlling. So I want to become a lawyer, and so the reason I came to therapy is because everything's getting in the way of this happening, and this is what I want, and it's not happening, and it's causing anxiety, and I want you to help me get rid of the anxiety and get back on the track of becoming a lawyer, whatever it is his goal is. From an Islamic perspective, it's completely reorienting what the goal is. The goal is not necessarily becoming a lawyer or becoming whatever the person wants to become. It's becoming who they truly are, which is a soul that is a reflection of Allah and that is at the mercy of Allah. And therefore, the goal for the person's life, in order to be in line with fitrah, really should be about wanting what Allah wants for them, and sort of being willing to let go of the pictures and projections of what they thought they wanted in life. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be this bummer, tell people to give up their hopes and dreams and to not pursue things in life. People to have direction,
right?
But it's about understanding that being willing to let go of what they thought their direction was or what their ultimate goal was, and getting in line with this notion of Allah knows best what for you, and wanting what Allah wants is going to actually put you in a place of having all the things that people want: happiness, fulfillment. This is where you truly get it from. And so these things are really, really fundamentally different, and it comes down to this essence of what we are in the soul from an Islamic perspective is we are servants of Allah. The thing that we're coming back to, this knowledge of Allah, is in the fitrah. What we were born on in the fitrah is a witnessing of Allah, that we were, before birth, all of the souls said,
Alastu bi rabbikum.
Bala shahidna. We witnessed this, and so in our nature is to be servants of Allah. And so if we're doing anything else other than that, we're going to be serving something else, because we are by nature slaves. So we'll be a slave of something else, if not Allah. And being a slave of anything else is going to cause different sets of problems that people then experience as presenting problems. And so it's sorting that out by plugging them into this deeper reality.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that point, which is very important. This idea that part of getting back to God or reconnecting to your divine relationship essence, the theomorphic reality of who you are meant to be, right? Allah says He created Adam as the Khalifa, right? Or all of us humans, we're supposed to be representatives of the divine reality in this earth or in this world. And so one of the things that is very common these days is this dogma of individuality and independence. It's like none of us are independent, you know? I get so rubbed the wrong way when people are just like, oh, I'm so independent, or it's all about independence. It's like, in reality, you're not independent. You're actually completely dependent, and everything about you is contingent to the ultimate reality, which is Allah. So I love that example you gave of like the ego sometimes falls into the delusion that it's in charge, it's in control, and it actually determines everything in its destiny, right? But what I'm hearing you say is this: we have to melt into this greater ocean of the divine reality and recognize we're a part of it, not separate from it. And that's one way to understand perhaps this notion of tawheed. So if I see myself as a drop in the ocean, I can move with the ocean as well as be moved by the ocean, rather than thinking I'm like this floating drop of water that has nothing to do with anything else around me, kind of thing. Like, and that maybe is part of the reason why many people do feel things like anxiety or depression or what have you, because they still have to break free from this idea that they are really individual and really independent in the dogmatic sense, right? I'm not
exactly, and like, you know, melting into the tawheed of Allah. It doesn't have to be, you know, we think of it sounds like such this esoteric thing that is only about this really deep spiritual religious experience. And people want to separate that out from like, okay, well, yeah, that's that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is just, you know, mental health and dealing with life and regular life problems. Well, you know, I think people are missing the point here, and they separate these two things out. And what they're not understanding, you're constantly, you know, sometimes you can say like, well, you know, these things are connected. Allah is the answer. And people want to come back to saying, well, but that's out there. That's that spiritual thing that is reserved for another sector of life. And then there's life. There's daily life. And this is where you sort of, people have to be guided to bring those two things together and understand like the reason why things are out of alignment and why you're experiencing difficulty in life is because you're not prioritizing this other, you know, esoteric reality. And, you know, when you approach everything from this perspective of witnessing Allah and doing things for the sake of Allah and recognizing your dependence on Allah and not your independence, then all of those things that you're struggling with in life will sort themselves out, or they get sorted out because the reason that they existed to begin with was because you were trying to determine your own life and trying to sort out what you want to happen, or when conflicts come to you, you're you know, meeting them with more conflict and causing more friction, rather than accepting things as being made by Allah and that you are a servant of Allah. And so then, you know, that doesn't mean conflict doesn't come to you. It means when it comes to you, you see it as coming from Allah. You're not resisting it. You're not saying, like, I don't want this to happen. This is horrible. This shouldn't be happening. And then creating all kinds of different segments and permutations of essentially the symptom of separation, you know, or a symptom of like trying to be self-propelled or self-regulated in your own life. When really the solution and the healing and the ultimate goal of is submission to Allah, because this way is better, and it will be what will align you with your fitrah and make you living in this place within that dunya life in a way that you are ultimately looking for when you're saying, well, things aren't working out and I want them to be this way and I want them to be that way. You get that. You just have to give up getting it in the way that you pictured that it would be.
Right. Yeah, because it's, all the terms that our religion defines, Islam, Iman. I mean, Salima means, to be surrendered or to feel safe and secure. Iman also means security and trust and protection. These are some of the meanings. And it's like, because a lot of people, I think when they hear these terms, like you just have to submit to God and you just have to surrender, they don't realize that the power or the empowerment, right, or the true autonomy comes from acceptance and acknowledgement that you are completely dependent on this ultimate source that's running the show. We're not in charge. We're not in control. So for instance, it's like if I really want this job or I want this school or I want this woman or whatever, like I want to marry this person, right? And my ego is attached to a particular outcome or a particular process to go exactly the way I want it, when I want it, how I want it. There's too much of me in the way. That doesn't really allow me to go with the flow of whatever the universe is going to, take me for that ride, right? Which is essentially Allah's way of directing and driving everything, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does constantly communicate and respond to us. But how are we ever going to know that if we're not paying attention? And how can we pay attention if we're not connected or have any knowledge or vision or understanding of the one we're trying to relate to? It's like you're going to miss a lot of things in your life. Right? And I found that when my states of Iman were, let's say, lesser or suboptimal, I felt a lot of those things that you're describing, like more anxiety, more stress, more negative thinking, and that can result into, drastic or impulsive decisions, right? And then in other times when I don't feel those things and I really feel like I don't get up in the morning and go, okay, what do I got to do today? It's like, what does Allah want to do with me? That doesn't change the fact that I'm still going to get up and have breakfast with my family or go to work, but you're constantly reminding yourself and modifying your mentality, if you will, so that the automatic, operative mode of your mind or your consciousness is, I am a part of this ocean, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one actually running everything. I'm just a recipient and a vehicle and an actor or a participant in this. Albeit it's limited, but I still have to recognize that there are so many things beyond me. But when I kind of let go and let God, as they say, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I pay attention and I remember God and I follow the principles of the religion, all of a sudden I get way more clarity, organization, empowerment, and autonomy, if you will, simply because I, accepted the reality that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above and beyond myself. And the other point you brought up, which was really important to highlight here, is God is not out there, right? Like you said, we tend to externalize God. He's just another object out there. Like one day I want to get married, one day I want to get a car, one day I want to get closer to God out there, right? It's like, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with you wherever you go, right? He knows what you whisper to yourself. He's closer to you than jugular vein. This is what you're talking about. It's a very practical, moment-to-moment reality. It's not something that you only slice a pie of, a piece of at this time and that's it, and then the rest of the time you forget about it. It's like you're a kafir in between prayer or something. It's like, okay, when I pray, it's like this, but when between it, I don't even care or think about any of that stuff. That's not what you're describing here to me. It sounds like you're saying this is your operative mode of perception, of relating to yourself, to others, to the world, and all of that is coming through the relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
It's about making it practical and applicable. It's not making religion and Allah as this giant in the hills, that is, mysterious and removed. It's the reality. It's the reality of our lives, and there's no other reason that we're here. And so we need to integrate that into what we're here for. And that doesn't mean we can't be here and living our dunya lives. We have to be. It's part of Islam. And I think this is where people get misled in understanding, well, we have this will. And so, it's knowing what to use that will for. People think, well, it's up to me to get things done. And yes, to a certain degree, you have to make choices and you have to have direction. And it's not to say that like you sit back and just, are an inactive part of this and Allah just moves you and works with you. Allah says, I will not change the people until they change what is within themselves. That means you need to use that willpower to do something. You use the willpower to make changes within yourself and also to sort of have notions of like, I would like to buy a house for my family one day, or I would like to, have this type of life. Fine. You could. It's Allah, exactly. It's understanding that like you can use that will to orient you towards a direction and make certain, footsteps towards a certain direction. But then within every step, you have to be aligning yourself with the reality that you're not the ultimate decider of what actually happens in the end, and that you have to understand that what you have determined as the end may not in essence be the best end for you. So it's complicated, it's somewhat of a paradox, this will, because at the same time we have will, and yet Allah is in control of everything. And so I think people from a philosophical standpoint get stuck in not knowing how to understand how to do both of those things. And I think, there has to be an area of allowing for that paradox. And it's only a paradox because in our reality, we have a hard time making sense of that because we're used to cause and effect and linear dunya reality. But in the bigger reality of Allah, those things actually exist at the same time. We have will, and Allah's in control of everything. Like, it may make your head pop trying to sort it out, but it's why, things like tether your camel and trust in Allah. You have to do your part, but you have to, in the end, submit.
Don't forget to leave us a lovely review on iTunes today. Support this podcast at patreon.com/Coffee with Karim. Have a lovely day.
Submit. Submit.